Today I am pleased to welcome to the studio Dr. Katerina Bulgarella, where we are going to talk about her work, her recent work published by SAI Global, Predicting Risk, a strategic culture framework for the C-suite. For those not familiar with Katerina's work and background, Katerina is a culture architect and ethics advisor who collaborates with SAI Global. Over the years, Katerina has been a thought partner to senior executives on a range of issues, including corporate culture, business ethics, change management, leadership development, employee engagement, and talent management. Katerina holds a PhD in organizational psychology and MAs in personal psychology and organizational psychology from New York University. She is currently serving as an adjunct professor in the Organizational Psychology Master's Program at NYU. So Katerina, welcome.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure. The SAI Global paper is just wonderful.
Thank you.
It's an incredible piece of research.
I'm glad you
And
appreciate it.
let's start with what you talk about in terms of unresolved gaps. Okay? And what you address is this unresolved gap between stated values and what an organization truly values.
Yes.
Right? And your proposition is that forces individuals to face difficult ethical choices on a routine basis. So let's take a deeper dive into those gaps.
Yeah, let me break it down.
Okay.
Let me use an example. Let's take Acme, an imaginary company.
Okay.
Let's assume that integrity is one of Acme's core values,
Okay.
right? So
A stated value.
A stated value, exactly. As people are trained, they are socialized to what integrity means. Just communications are designed around integrity. Integrity is part of what is talked about in the code of conduct, and so forth.
What I sometimes call wall posters and splashy
Yes,
intranet messages.
Exactly. It's going to be on the wall, most likely. But at a certain level, it's going to be part of the culture,
Sure.
right? One of the things that Acme values. The problem is that probably integrity is not the only thing that Acme values. In fact, in the case of Acme, just the organization tends to put a lot of emphasis on aggressive revenue growth.
Okay.
And that, just the norms, expectations, goals around revenue growth really infuse a great deal of what goes on at Acme.
Okay.
So you have, it's not that growth and integrity don't go together, but beyond a certain point, depending on how these priorities are structured and talk to each other, there starts to be a certain amount of tension. And when that tension is sort of left to itself and just starts bubbling up, then that's the point where you see people having to deal with dilemmas. The same thing could be true, for example, if one of Acme's value is safety,
Right.
for example, and from a business standpoint, Acme puts a lot of emphasis on cost effectiveness
Sure.
or efficiency, right? Does this resonate? I mean, how do you look at the divide between stated values and what the organization actually values?
Okay.
From what do you think?
So we're not here to wage war on business objectives.
No, we're
right?
not. No.
So I see part of this as just an inherent, even well-intentioned
Yes.
tension. Right? So let's go back to Acme.
Yes.
Acme's committed to top-line growth, to organizational growth. To me, along the way, values will get challenged, right? So that's a normal part of what I think is business development and a commitment to growth. So we have integrity and ethics, and we have a commitment to growth, right? Those are wonderful organizational traits. So going back to this situation, where they may start off in alignment,
Yes.
how do you see them going off course to where a gap develops?
To me, it's really about how a number of things. The way in which we introduce values in an organization, right? And the way in which values are developed, as well as the way we talk about ethics and the way we think about the relationship between ethics and business, right? And another important piece, in my opinion, is what type of beliefs we have attached to being successful in business.
Okay.
I do agree with you that these priorities do not have to be in conflict with each other, right? But one problem, that oftentimes emerges has to do with the fact that here we have a conversation about ethics, and here we have a conversation about business, right?
They're coming out of two different voices.
Exactly, and there is, and we are really not focusing on that tension between the two, acknowledging it in a way that just helps us understand where these priorities may in fact conflict, how they can affect people in different roles, and so that is inherently a source of risk that companies are not addressing.
And I think that's a great point, because a company that's going to acknowledge that those tensions are going to be there, right? That they're part of organizational design, and that is very forward-leaning, and to say, look, in our commitment to growth, we know that our ethics and integrity and our compliance programs might start to look a little gray, right? Especially in some regions where maybe local values and norms might appear to conflict with our rules and our values. But there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly.
Right? We can be competent and confused.
Exactly. And you touch on a very important point. It's the willingness and sort of the to look into the gray area, to acknowledge the gray area. The gray area is part of how things play out. Business is complex. It entails in conflicting and competing demands. So it's important to really to acknowledge that aspect and to look into it, to better understand it, to have a deeper sense of what those conflicts might be about, how they might affect people in their roles, and how risk can escalate, and really just translate into a bad outcome.
So are you proposing that companies sort of engage groups on these on these areas that could be a potential conflict, a potential tension? And if so, Katerina, which groups should they be focusing on? Where do you see these gaps as having the biggest sort of negative consequences on a globally dispersed workforce?
I think that the work of insight and assessment, crowdsourcing, just getting feedback from people, that is absolutely critical. And I think that depending on their role, on where they are in an organization, people are going to face different dilemmas, different trade-offs. So if you are at the front line, probably just a dilemma that has to do with aggressive growth may affect you more so than people in operations who might be more affected by a dilemma around efficiency vis-a-vis safety. So I think it's important to recognize two things. That it's not just about one class, one group of dilemmas, but a variety of dilemmas. And these dilemmas, these trade-offs are going to play out, are going to affect certain groups more than others, as you were suggesting. And therefore, we need to get insights from those stakeholders
Got it.
to better understand how these tensions affect the work life, the challenges they face every day in the organization, and particularly if we are talking about teams and individuals who may not just be in the organization, who might operate with a certain amount of autonomy.
Sure.
And I'm sure you have some insight.
Thinly supervised, working
Yeah,
remotely.
exactly.
But I think your point is right. Different areas are going to have different risks, right? So
Yes.
if it's a commercial workforce, it's the traditional, maybe the pressure to succeed versus the pressure to comply.
Yeah.
But if it's people in operations and manufacturing, it could be that sort of DNA of always being safe, right? Workplace safety, and rushing to get shipments out the door at the end of a quarter.
Exactly. Take the case of Kobe Aluminium,
Okay.
right? We heard about the whole issue that they had with quality, right? And how they sort of manufactured quality data, and because they were not able to comply with quality standards, keeping everything else
Sure.
just in check, in terms of profit, in terms of efficiency, in terms of delivering products to their customers, just on a very short turnaround. For them, that just the sort of I assume quality was very important to them, but it was one specific, priority that eventually, just sort of crumbled against
Right.
the weight of these other priorities, right? So, taking a shortcut. At that point, you have to be profitable, you have to be efficient,
Sure.
you have to be fast, right? And you have to, your products have to meet certain quality standards. How to get there? But, well, there is a sort of slippery slope effect
Right.
over time. Well, maybe, this time, we've gone through all the checks that we need to go through. We complied, so something gets skipped.
Take a shortcut.
Exactly. And that gets compounded over time. And here you have a pattern of behavior that is inconsistent with certain standards.
So in your research and talking to you, I mean, it's so exciting. I feel like I'm a kid in a behavioral candy shop, right? What are some of the influences, some of the pressures or the financial pressure points that you see coming up time and time again as leading to maybe conflicting messages, right? So where do you see some of those sort of behavioral tipping points?
It's an interesting question, and I think it's sort of a plurality of forces that get people to the point where, in fact, they might choose the wrong course of action.
Okay.
It's interesting if you look at it from the standpoint of behavioral, science,
Right.
and what research is telling us. It's interesting that people are not more likely to cheat based on how much they have to gain.
Okay.
That is a sort of a misconception. The idea that we think that people will be more likely to cheat just because there is a lot of money to
The economic rationale.
right?
Okay.
And the other, based on the risk that they face, right? Those are not two, just big drivers. The drivers, the main drivers, have to do with experiencing a conflict of interest.
Okay.
And having a way to rationalize your behavior. Now, think about placing certain demands on employees, on people in organization, in terms, for example, of aggressive revenue growth, and attaching, that type of aspiration to goals, reinforcing it via certain incentives.
Okay.
For example, just in terms of, bonus, or just a negative incentive. If you don't meet your target for the
Sure.
year, there is an issue in terms of job security, right? A situation like that one is creating a conflict of interest,
Okay.
right? If you structure certain priorities in such a personal way, then there starts being a conflict between self-interest
Right.
and the organization's best interest. Now, if you add to that the sort of the implications of having sort of a concurrent conversation. On the one hand, we talk about integrity
Sure.
at Acme, and we say that integrity is important. On the other hand, we are talking about aggressive growth all the time. And so,
Sure.
and so you hear all this chatter around, we have to meet, our targets for the year. It's like do or die. It's about the viability of the business, et cetera, which are all very rational points, right? But at the same time, those points create material for rationalizing one's behavior. Okay, so at a certain point, I'm being told that certain things are very important for the business to be successful, right? So I can take that information and use it, just manipulate it,
Sure.
in terms of, and so you have two conditions already that increase the likelihood that people will not do the right thing. Pressure that goes with having to mind competing priorities is also another, just factor, right? So, and I'm curious, going back to, does this resonate? Do you see, just points that are relevant in terms of your own experience?
Sure. Going back to my younger self, it goes back from, and I'm speaking from the commercial perspective, not manufacturing. Yeah, those gaps are there. I mean, I signed FCPA paperwork. I knew the law before I took my first flight in my 10 years as an international sales executive. But I also understood what my goals were, what my objectives were, right? And that was a very loud, yet unspoken message to me of what management really wanted, right? Now, look, I want to be clear, cheating was a choice, so I wasn't pressured to do anything. But the voice of get the business done, when that gets very, very loud, particularly in a public company environment where it gets ratcheted and repeated on a quarterly basis, I think that has a huge impact on workforce behavior, right? Particularly where people are compensated on individual performance. I used to call that eat what you kill, right? So the organization isn't saying, part of your performance, part of how we evaluate you is based on how the corporation's doing, on how your division is doing. How well you know the product. Are you delivering services and products the way we'd like you to? But when you boil it down to a single measure in a high-risk environment, I think that can be very overwhelming. And I happen to 100% agree that's where you have an ethical gap, right? Between the spoken message of here's your compliance, here's your code of conduct, you need to sign this, you need to understand it, and out of a different voice comes, here's your objectives.
And that's also where I think you, as an organization, start creating unwittingly a conflict of interest between self-interest and the organization's best interests,
Exactly.
so-called common good, right? So it's interesting. we may not think about it that way, but the introduction of that conflict of interest, the misalignment between self and the organization is really a key ingredient as we try to understand ethical risk and why people in the end might be more likely to do certain things.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's a misalignment between the self and the corporation. So that's a good place to end.
Okay.
And we're going to start moving towards solutions in our next interview.
Sounds great.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.